The needle-pierced worn leather with the steady rhythm Sarah Mitchell had perfected over 3 years of solitude. October morning light filtered through the storefront window of Mitchell's Leatherworks, catching dust motes that danced above her workbench like memories she couldn't quite grasp. The steel wolf's vest lay before her, its black leather scarred by road rash and time, the wolf patch on the back faded from years under the Oregon sun. Her fingers moved automatically, pulling thread through torn seams, rebuilding what had been broken. The air compressor in the back room kicked on with a mechanical wheeze that stopped her hands mid-stitch. The sound morphed in her mind, became the thrum of helicopter rotors beating against storm winds, became the shriek of hydraulics failing, became screaming she couldn't silence. Sarah's grip tightened on the needle until her knuckles whitened. She counted backwards from 10 in her head, a trick the VA therapist had taught her before she stopped going to appointments. 10, 9, 8. The compressor shut off. Silence returned to the small shop on Cedar Avenue, but her heartbeat still hammered against her ribs. November 2017. 3 years, 11 months, and 16 days since the rope snapped, and Petty Officer Marcus Chen vanished into 50-foot waves. Since Seaman Riley Torres followed him into the black water, her scream cut short by the ocean's indifference. Since Chief Warrant Officer David Park went in after them both because that was the code, because you never left anyone behind, because Sarah had been the one leading the rescue and she should have seen the frayed line, should have called it off, should have saved them all. She finished the stitch and set the vest aside. The clock on the wall read 8:47 a.m. Red Haven was stirring outside her window, Saturday morning traffic picking up along the main street of this coastal town that had become her hiding place. She'd chosen Oregon for its distance from everything she'd known, for its gray skies that matched her mood, for the way people here minded their own business and didn't ask questions about why a 35-year-old woman ran a leather repair shop instead of doing something that mattered. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up to see a man in his 30s, barrel-chested with arms that suggested he earned his living with his hands. He wore a steel wolf's cut over a thermal shirt, the patches marking him as a full member. He carried a leather saddlebag with a broken buckle. His eyes swept the shop with the awareness Sarah recognized from her own service. He cataloged exits, assessed threats that didn't exist, settled into readiness that would never completely fade. Combat doesn't leave you when you leave it. It just learns to wait. The biker set the saddlebag on her counter. Storm damage, water got in. Can you fix it? Sarah examined the bag, noted the quality of the original work, the way someone had cared for this piece before the ocean decided otherwise. 24 hours in rice first. Pull the moisture out, then I'll replace the buckle, recondition the leather. 3 days. The man nodded, already reaching for his wallet. Respect showed in the economy of his movement, the way he didn't question her assessment. Word had gotten around Red Haven that the woman who ran Mitchell's knew her craft. Fair price, good work, no conversation required. She wrote up the receipt, kept her head down, avoided eye contact longer than professional courtesy demanded. The biker pulled cash from his wallet, counted out bills that bore the wear of being handled by working hands. Marcus Brennan's having us check our gear before winter. Wants everything in top shape. Sarah kept her expression neutral. The Steel Wolves president, she'd seen him around town, heard the locals speak his name with respect instead of fear. Different from the motorcycle clubs that made the news for violence and federal raids. Different, but still something she kept herself separate from. The biker pocketed his receipt. You ever need anything? We take care of our own. And people who take care of us. She met his eyes then, saw the sincerity there, the offer of protection she hadn't asked for. I appreciate that. I'm good. He left. The bell chimed again. Sarah returned to the vest on her workbench, but found her hands too unsteady for the detailed work. She stood, walked to the window, watched the biker mount a black Harley and kick it to life. The engine's rumble carried through the glass, a sound that had become part of Red Haven's daily soundtrack. Movement down the street caught her attention. A formation of motorcycles rolled past, 15 or 20 bikes moving in tight formation. The lead rider was older, gray, visible in the beard beneath his full-face helmet, but his posture on the bike spoke of decades of experience. Marcus Brennan, she assumed. The club president she'd never formally met but whose presence shaped the rhythm of this town. Something about the way they moved struck a chord she couldn't name. Purpose without urgency, strength without aggression, brotherhood she'd lost when she walked away from the Coast Guard and everyone who'd known her before she became the officer who got her team killed. Sarah turned from the window and locked up the shop early. She needed air that didn't smell like leather and saddle soap, needed to move before the memories solidified into another panic attack. Her apartment was too small, too quiet, too full of the life she wasn't living. She grabbed her canvas tote bag and headed for the grocery store 3 blocks away. 10 miles across town, Frank Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses and studied the blueprint spread across his workshop table. The crib he was building had to be perfect. Mortise and tenon joints, not screws. Cherry wood that would last generations. Hand-rub finish that wouldn't off-gas chemicals near an infant's face. He'd been working on this piece for 6 weeks, ever since he'd learned through a mutual friend that his daughter was pregnant. Not that Sarah had told him directly. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since the funeral where he'd buried his wife, and Sarah had looked at him across the grave with eyes that held nothing but contempt for the man who'd been physically present but emotionally absent for most of her childhood. Frank had tried to reach out afterward, tried to bridge the gap that had become a canyon, but Sarah's phone number went straight to voicemail, and her letters came back marked "Return to Sender." So he built furniture for a grandchild he'd never hold. Built it anyway because the alternative was accepting that some bridges burned too completely to ever rebuild. His table saw wind to life, blades spinning at 3,450 RPM. The sound triggered something in his nervous system, turned his workshop in Red Haven into a firebase 75 clicks from Da Nang. For 3 heartbeats, he was 19 again, crouched behind sandbags while the M60 hammered out its death song and incoming mortars walked closer with each explosion. Frank's hands found the workbench edge. Grip, hold, count, breathe, the saw wound down. Organ returned. 55 years since he'd stepped off that transport in Vietnam. 55 years of carrying what he'd done and seen and become in that jungle war. The VA called it PTSD. Frank called it the price of surviving when better men didn't. The walls of his workshop held evidence of both lives he'd lived. His discharge papers from the Marine Corps, framed beside a photo of Force Recon Team Delta, 1969. 8 young men who believed the war mattered, who believed they'd return as heroes. Frank was one of 3 who came home. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories didn't have that luxury. On the opposite wall, photographs from a different brotherhood. Steel Wolves Motorcycle Club, 1972. Frank stood beside Jack Brennan, both men barely into their 20s, but already old in ways that civilian life couldn't understand. They'd founded the club as a place for warriors who couldn't adjust to peace, who needed the edge of danger and the bond of men who'd stand beside you when hell opened up. 23 years Frank had ridden with the Wolves. 23 years before his wife gave him the ultimatum that tore everything apart. The club or your family? Choose. He'd chosen family. Walked away from the only place he'd felt whole since Vietnam. Became a carpenter, a father who showed up to school events and helped with homework and pretended the civilian world didn't chafe like wool against sunburned skin. His wife had gotten what she wanted, a normal husband, a safe life, and 3 years of watching Frank slowly suffocate before cancer took her and left him alone with a daughter who couldn't forgive him for being miserable when he'd given up the only thing that made him feel alive. Frank measured twice, cut once. The wood smelled like hope he had no right to hold. Cherry shavings curled away from the hand plane as he smoothed joints that would outlast him by decades. He'd learned woodworking from his grandfather, learned that craft demanded presence and precision, learned that you could lose yourself in making things that would matter after you were gone. His phone buzzed. Text message from Gunner Pete Walsh, the only member of the original Steel Wolves who still spoke to him. Trouble brewing, serpents moving, stay off the streets today. Frank typed back with arthritic thumbs that made the small keyboard an exercise in frustration. Not my fight anymore. The response came immediately. Will be if it comes to your door. Watch yourself, Gears. No one had called him by his road name in 20 years. Gears, because he could diagnose any mechanical problem by sound alone, could rebuild an engine with nothing but intuition and experience. That man felt like someone else now, someone younger, someone who mattered. Frank set his phone down and returned to the crib, but his mind wandered to threat assessments he'd thought he had left behind. Shadow serpents had been making noise for months, pushing into territory the steel wolves had protected since the club's founding. Different world now, different rules. Marcus Brennan ran the wolves with more restraint than his father had, tried to keep things legitimate while still maintaining the code that defined them. But pressure was building. Frank could feel it the way he'd felt incoming weather in the jungle. Something was going to break. He finished planing the crib rail and checked his watch. 10:30 a.m. He needed wood stain from the hardware store downtown. Needed to get out of his own head before the memories took root and turned the day dark. Frank grabbed his jacket and truck keys. Paused at the door to look back at the photographs on the wall. The Marine who'd survived Quezon. The biker who'd built a brotherhood. The father who'd failed his daughter. Three men wearing the same face, all of them strangers to whoever he was now. He stepped into October sunshine that felt too bright for the weight he carried. The Steel Wolves clubhouse occupied a converted garage on the east edge of Red Haven, anonymous except for the bikes parked in formation out front. Inside, Marcus Brennan stood at the head of a scarred wooden table where his inner circle gathered. Maps covered the surface, marked with territories and routes in the kind of strategic thinking his father had taught him before a heart attack took Jack Brennan Sr. 10 years ago. Rex Stone leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. The club's vice president had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and brought that experience to his role. Tank Morrison, sergeant-at-arms, stood near the window, watching the street with the awareness that came from too many IEDs hidden in trash piles. 4 other senior members completed the council, each carrying their own scars from their own wars. And Gunner Pete Walsh, 68 years old, the last of the founding generation still active in the club. White hair pulled back in a ponytail, face carved by time and weather into something that belonged on Mount Rushmore. He'd been Jack Brennan's best friend, had helped build the Steel Wolves from nothing, had earned respect that transcended any patch or title. Marcus spread his hands over the map. Shadow serpents hit our supplier in Portland, put 2 of our guys in the hospital. This is the 3rd incident in 6 months. The escalation was unmistakable. Victor Castellano, who called himself Viper and ran the serpents like a personal fiefdom, had been pushing boundaries since spring, testing, probing, waiting for the wolves to either submit or respond with violence that would justify the war Viper clearly wanted. Rex cracked his knuckles, a sound like kindling, snapping. We hit back, hard. Show these punks what happens when you come at Steel Wolves. Marcus had expected this response. Rex was a good man, loyal and brave. But he'd learned his tactics in Helmand province where the answer to aggression was overwhelming force. That worked against the Taliban. It didn't work against a motorcycle club embedded in the same community you were trying to protect. And then what? We escalate until someone dies? Until the feds come down on all of us? Until this town we've protected for 50 years becomes a war zone? Tank shifted his weight, leather creaking. Marcus has a point. My kids go to school here. I don't want them dodging bullets because we couldn't walk away from a pissing contest. Gunner spoke for the first time, voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and engine exhaust. Jack faced this exact situation in 1987. Rival club out of California thought they could move in. We had a choice, fight or be smart. Everyone at the table knew the answer to that question, but Gunner let the silence build. Jack chose smart. We documented everything. Got evidence, let the law handle it. Club that threatened us, half their leadership went to federal prison. We kept our hands clean and our territory secure. Rex shook his head. Different era. Courts don't care about motorcycle clubs anymore. We're all guilty until proven terrorist, not if we're the ones helping instead of causing problems. Marcus pulled out his phone, showed them photos from the food drive the club had organized last month. From the veterans' funeral where 20 wolves were provided escort. From the high school where they'd sponsored a scholarship for kids who lost parents to overdoses. This is our real patch. What we do for Red Haven, that's worth more than any show of force. The door opened. One of the prospects stuck his head in, face tight with urgency. Got a call. Anonymous tip. Serpents are planning something today. Downtown, around noon. Every man at the table went still. Intel from unknown sources was suspect by definition, but ignoring it could mean walking into an ambush or missing the chance to prevent whatever Viper had planned. Marcus checked his watch. 11:15. We've got 45 minutes. Gunner, what's your read? The old man's eyes held the calculation of someone who'd survived by trusting his instincts. Viper wants reaction, wants us angry and stupid. But if he's making a move in broad daylight, he's confident, which means he's got an angle we're not seeing. Tank moved from the window. What if we just show presence? Roll through downtown. Let everyone see we're watching. Don't engage unless they force it. The suggestion had merit. Visible deterrence without provocation. Marcus weighed options against consequences, aware that whatever he decided in the next 60 seconds could determine whether Red Haven stayed peaceful or descended into open conflict. We take 20 bikes, no weapons, just presence. We grab lunch at the diner, we're visible, we go home. Anyone tries something, we document it and let Linda Hayes sort it out. Rex started to protest, but Gunner cut him off with a raised hand. That's the right call. Your father would approve. The mention of Jack Brennan carried weight that transcended logic or strategy. Marcus's father had built the Steel Wolves on principles that separated them from gangs and criminals. Protection, not predation. Justice, not revenge. Brotherhood, not blind loyalty. Those principles had kept the club strong for 5 decades. Marcus wouldn't abandon them now. Gunner stood, joints audibly popping. Your father and I started this club with one rule. We protect what's ours, but we don't start wars. If Viper wants to fight, he'll have to throw the first real punch. The meeting broke. Members dispersed to their bikes, radio checks conducted, formation planned with military precision. Marcus pulled on his jacket, settled his helmet, tried to ignore the tension building in his shoulders. Leadership meant carrying the weight of decisions that affected people you cared about. His father had carried that burden for 30 years. Now it was Marcus's turn. As the bikes fired up, Gunner moved beside him. Wish Frank was here. Man could read a setup from miles away. Marcus had heard stories about Frank Mitchell all his life. The Marine who'd saved his father's life in Vietnam. The founding member who'd walked away when his wife demanded it. The legend who'd chosen family over brotherhood and paid for it with exile. Frank Mitchell still alive? Lives here. Red Haven. Has for 10 years. The revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow. A founding member, living in the same town, and no one had reached out. No one had tried to heal that wound. Pride and principle had built walls where bridges should have stood. My father never forgave him for leaving. Gunner's face softened with something that might have been regret. Your father died angry. Don't make the same mistake. They mounted up. 20 Harley-Davidsons, a rolling thunder of American steel and veteran resolve. The formation pulled out onto Main Street, heading toward downtown Red Haven and whatever waited there. Sarah emerged from the grocery store with her canvas bag full of ingredients for meals she'd eat alone. The day had warmed into the kind of October perfection that made her resent the beauty she couldn't enjoy. Couples walked hand in hand along the sidewalk. Families browsed shop windows, life continuing for people who hadn't broken themselves beyond repair. She started toward home but detoured at the last minute. Her apartment felt like a cage today. The park by the harbor offered space and the sound of waves that sometimes helped quiet the noise in her head. Sarah cut through the side streets, taking the long way, postponing the inevitable return to solitude. The rumble of motorcycles reached her before she saw them. Sarah turned onto Pine Street and spotted the formation of Steel Wolves rolling past the diner. 20 bikes moving in tight coordination, the lead rider's gray beard visible beneath his helmet. Marcus Brennan, she was certain now. The president who commanded respect through presence rather than fear. They parked in formation outside the Red Haven diner, kickstands down in unison like a military drill. Sarah watched from across the street as the riders dismounted, stretched, moved toward the entrance. Normal men doing normal things. Except for the awareness they carried, the way they positioned themselves to maintain sight lines and cover exits. Warriors trying to be civilians. She understood that tension intimately. Marcus stood outside the diner with two other members, holding a coffee cup and laughing at something one of them said. The sound carried across the street, genuine and warm, human. Sarah felt something shift in her perception. These weren't criminals or thugs. They were veterans finding purpose in brotherhood, trying to protect their community in the only way that made sense to them. She turned to continue walking. Movement between two parked cars stopped her cold. Combat training overrides conscious thought. Sarah's hindbrain recognized the threat 3 seconds before her rational mind could process the information. Sunlight glinting off metal. The wrong kind of metal. Gun barrel. The angle of the arm holding it. The target it pointed toward. Marcus Brennan stood outside the diner, completely unaware of the death aimed at his chest. Time fractured. Sarah's bag hit the sidewalk. Her legs were moving before she decided to move. 3 strides to close 15 feet. Her shoulder dropped low, all her weight behind the impact. She hit Marcus like a linebacker, driving him sideways and back. The gunshot cracked across Pine Street with the finality of a door slamming shut on normal life. Pain exploded in Sarah's upper arm, white-hot and immediate. She spun with the impact, but training kept her on her feet. Never go down. Going down means dying. She caught herself against the brick wall, left hand pressed to her right arm, where blood already soaked through her jacket. The shooter's footsteps echoed as he fled. Young, Sarah's mind cataloged. Scared. Amateur. The details filed themselves away automatically while the present demanded her attention. Marcus was on the ground, staring up at her with shock and disbelief. The two men who'd been talking with him exploded into motion, one sprinting after the shooter, the other dropping beside Sarah. His hands reached for her arm. "I'm fine," she heard herself say. The words sounded distant, spoken by someone else. "I'm fine." But the blood spreading down her sleeve told a different story. The diner doors burst open, customers spilling out, voices raised in panic and confusion. Someone shouted for an ambulance. The world tilted slightly. Sarah locked her knees, refused to let the shock win. She'd been shot in training accidents before. This wasn't that different. The bullet had passed through, clean in, clean out. Lucky. Always lucky, except when it mattered. Marcus stood, caught himself against the wall beside her, his hand steadied her shoulder. "Why did you do that?" Sarah met his eyes. Couldn't quite find words to explain how instinct had overridden self-preservation. How 3 years of numbness had cracked the moment she saw another person about to die. How maybe she'd been waiting for a chance to save someone, to prove she wasn't just the officer who got her team killed. Reflex. That was all she could manage. Training. The sound of a truck door slamming cut through the chaos. Sarah looked up to see an older man running toward them. 65, maybe older. Moving with the urgency of someone whose body remembered how, even if his joints protested. He pushed through the gathering crowd with authority, born from decades of command. "That's my daughter." The words hit Sarah like a second bullet. "Let me through. That's my daughter." She knew the voice before she saw the face. 5 years of silence hadn't erased the timbre that had defined her childhood. Frank Mitchell, her father, the man she tried to forget. And here he was, in Red Haven, in this moment, when her world had just exploded into violence and blood. "Dad?" Frank reached her, hands hovering over her wounded arm like he was afraid to touch something he might break. "What are you doing here?" The question should have been hers. Sarah felt the edges of her vision darkening, shock finally catching up to adrenaline's retreat. "I live here. Have for 3 years. His face went pale. "You've been here?" "In Red Haven? 3 years. The words came out bitter. 30 miles from wherever he'd been hiding. 30 miles they'd both spent avoiding each other in a town too small for that to be coincidence. Frank's attention snapped to Marcus. "Who shot at you?" The rider who'd chased the shooter returned, shaking his head. "Lost him in the alleys. Kid, maybe late 20s. Not professional." Marcus's hand still steadied Sarah's shoulder. His voice carried the authority of someone used to giving orders in crisis. She pushed me out of the way. Took the bullet meant for me. Frank's eyes found Sarah's. Something moved in that gaze she hadn't seen since before her mother died. Pride, maybe, or grief for the daughter who'd needed to learn how to take bullets for strangers. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The ambulance was coming. Police would follow. Sarah tried to stand straighter, tried to project strength she didn't entirely feel. The wound burned now, nerve endings reporting damage her brain had finally accepted. Frank moved beside her, not touching, but present. "I'm riding with you to the hospital." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need him, hadn't needed him for 5 years, wasn't going to start needing him now. But the words wouldn't come. Blood loss or shock, or the weight of seeing her father's face after convincing herself she didn't care what happened to him. Marcus looked between them, processing the revelation. Frank Mitchell, as in Gears? Recognition dawned. "You're Jack Brennan's boy. Jack's gone. 10 years now. Heart attack." Something passed over Frank's face. Sorrow or regret or the accumulation of too many deaths witnessed over too many years. "I'm sorry. He was a good man." The ambulance turned onto Pine Street, lights painting the scene in red and white. Paramedics emerged with practiced efficiency, one already moving towards Sarah. She let them work, let them cut away her jacket, expose the wound that looked worse than it probably was. Through and through, the lead paramedic announced, "Clean entry and exit." Lucky, that word again. Sarah almost laughed. Lucky to take a bullet. Lucky to still be standing. Lucky to be alive when the people she was supposed to save weren't. They loaded her onto the gurney. Frank climbed into the ambulance without asking permission, his presence both unwanted and necessary. As the doors closed, Sarah caught one last glimpse of Marcus Brennan standing beside his bike, his hand pressed to the wall where a bullet hole marked how close he'd come to dying. The ambulance pulled away. Sarah closed her eyes, let the pain medication they'd already administered pull her towards something that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't consciousness either. Her father's hand found hers, rough with calluses from carpentry work. She didn't pull away. Red Haven General Hospital had the sterile smell of institutions everywhere. Frank Mitchell sat in the waiting room while they treated Sarah, his hands clasped between his knees, his mind racing through calculations he'd thought he'd left behind. Someone had tried to kill Marcus Brennan. His daughter had thrown herself in the path of that bullet, and now they were both caught in whatever hell was about to break loose. The sliding doors opened. Marcus walked in, leather jacket creaking. Behind him came more steel wolves, a half-dozen riders who spread out through the waiting room with the territorial awareness of men who'd learned to secure perimeters in worse places than a hospital lobby. Heads turned. Conversations died. The bikers ignored the attention, focused entirely on their president. Marcus stopped in front of Frank, sat down uninvited in the next chair, studied Frank with the assessment of someone trained to read people under pressure. "Gunnar told me about you, about what you and my father built together." Frank kept his eyes forward, watching the hallway where Sarah had disappeared. "That was a long time ago. Different world." "Not that different. Someone just tried to kill me. Your daughter saved my life. That creates a bond, whether we want it or not. A bond." Frank turned the word over in his mind. The steel wolves ran on bonds. Brotherhood forged through shared danger and unwavering loyalty. He'd walked away from those bonds 20 years ago because his wife needed him to choose between his family and his club. He'd chosen family and lost them both anyway. Why is she here? In Red Haven? Marcus's question carried genuine curiosity, not interrogation. "I don't know," Frank's throat tightened. "We haven't spoken in 5 years. Not since her mother's funeral." Sarah looked at me across that grave like I was a stranger. Looked at me like she blamed me for every year her mother was married to a man who couldn't be what she needed. What did she need? Normal, safe. A husband who worked 9 to 5 and came home and watched television and didn't wake up screaming from nightmares about rice paddies and men dying. Frank's hands clenched together. I tried to be that man, killed something inside me trying. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "My father never forgave you for leaving." "I know," said. "You abandoned him. Abandoned the club when it mattered most." The accusation landed like a blade between Frank's ribs. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did. Marcus shook his head. "He was wrong. You chose your family. That's what we protect, isn't it? Family, even when family means walking away from everything else." The words hung between them, an absolution Frank hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Before he could respond, a doctor emerged from the treatment area, Older woman, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She scanned the waiting room, found Frank. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter is asking for you." Frank stood on knees that protested the sudden movement. Marcus rose with him, followed without asking permission. The doctor led them back through sterile hallways to a treatment room where Sarah sat on an examination table, her arm bandaged and immobilized in a sling. She looked small in the hospital gown, vulnerable in a way Frank hadn't seen since she was a child. Then her eyes found his, and the vulnerability vanished behind walls he'd helped her build. Walls that protected you from pain by making sure you never let anyone close enough to inflict it. The doctor pulled up Sarah's chart on a tablet, through and through gunshot wound to the right upper arm, missed the brachial artery by 2 centimeters. No bone involvement. You're extremely fortunate. Sarah's mouth twisted. Fortunate. You need to rest. Keep the arm immobilized for at least a week. No heavy lifting. Come back in 5 days for a wound check. The doctor fixed Sarah with a look that suggested she'd seen too many patients ignore medical advice. "I'm serious about the rest. Your body needs time to heal." Frank read the resistance in Sarah's posture. She'd never been good at sitting still, at accepting limitations. That had made her a good Coast Guard officer. It had also made her reckless when recklessness wasn't needed. The doctor left. Frank and Marcus stood in the small room while Sarah studied her bandaged arm. Marcus broke the silence first. "You Coast Guard?" Sarah glanced up. "Was. Left 3 years ago. What changed?" The question was casual, but the weight behind it suggested Marcus knew exactly what could make someone leave military service abruptly. Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Frank spoke before the silence became hostile. "She was search and rescue, 13 years. One of the best they had." Sarah's eyes cut to him. "Don't. I'm proud of you. No matter what happened. No matter why you left." The words came out rougher than Frank intended. "I should have told you that more. Should have told you a lot of things. You weren't there to tell me anything." The accusation hit its mark. You were physically present and emotionally checked out. "Mom tried to make you happy. I tried. But you were miserable every day you weren't on a bike with your club. So spare me the proud father routine now." Marcus shifted, uncomfortable witness to family wounds he hadn't meant to reopen. "I should go." "No." Sarah's voice stopped him. "You should know why someone tried to kill you. Do you know who it was?" Marcus pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. Security camera caught this. Dylan Cross, 28, Shadow Serpents Prospect. Frank leaned in to see the screen, felt his world tilt on its axis. That face. He knew that face. Younger than the last time he'd seen it, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "I know that kid." Frank's voice came out hoarse. "His grandfather, Tommy Cross, served with me, died at Khe Sanh in '71. The room went silent. 3 people processing the implications of Vietnam War connections reaching across 53 years to put a bullet through Sarah's arm. Marcus lowered his phone. "You sure?" Frank was already doing the math. Tommy shipped out in early '70. Kid was born in '70 or '71. Tommy died before he even knew he had a son. But I knew. He showed me pictures in the firebase. Showed me his wife and his infant boy. Made me promise to look after them if he didn't make it home. Did you?" Shame burned through Frank's chest. "No. I came back to the world so messed up I could barely function. Lost track of Tommy's family. Lost track of everything except trying to survive one day at a time." Sarah watched him with an expression he couldn't read. "So this kid's grandfather saved your life?" "No," Frank met her eyes. "I was pinned down by NVA fire. Tommy pulled me to cover. Took shrapnel meant for me. I held his hand while he died. Promised him I'd make sure his boy knew his father died a hero. I failed that promise like I failed everything else." Marcus pocketed his phone. "So the kid who shot at me is connected to you. Connected to my father through your service together. And my father's daughter took the bullet. The web of connections was too tangled to be coincidence." Frank felt the old instincts rising. Threat assessment overlaying personal history. "This doesn't make sense. Why would Tommy Cross's grandson be working for Shadow Serpents? Why target you? Someone's pulling strings." Marcus moved toward the door. "I need to find out who and why. Sarah, you did what no one else could have done today. Thank you doesn't cover it. But thank you." He left. The room felt smaller, with just Frank and Sarah remaining. She adjusted her sling, winced at the movement. Frank resisted the urge to help, knowing his assistance would be rejected. How long have you been in Red Haven? 10 years. Frank sat in the chair Marcus had vacated. Moved here after your mother died. Needed somewhere that wasn't full of her ghost. And you never reached out. Never tried to find me. I did. You made it clear you didn't want contact. The accusation carried no heat, just exhausted acceptance. I respected that, even if it killed me. Sarah looked at him then, really looked, and Frank wondered what she saw. An old man wearing his father's face. A stranger who'd given up everything that mattered and still ended up alone. A warrior who'd survived combat but couldn't survive peace. Why did you leave the club? Sarah's question carried genuine curiosity beneath the anger. Mom told me you had to choose, but she never explained why it mattered so much. Why she needed you to walk away from the only thing that made you whole. Frank leaned back, felt his spine protest. 30 years of riding and fighting and living hard had accumulated in his joints. Because I did things, when I was with the Steel Wolves. Things your mother found out about. Things that proved I was still the man who came back from Vietnam, broken and violent and barely controlled. What things? Frank closed his eyes, saw the faces of men he'd hurt. Rival bikers who'd threatened Steel Wolves families and learned that protection came with consequences. Business owners who tried to push drugs in Red Haven and found themselves facing warriors who wouldn't allow it. The club operated in moral gray areas the law couldn't or wouldn't touch. Frank had been good at that work. Too good. Things that would make you ashamed of me. More ashamed than you already are. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, I'm not ashamed of you. I'm angry at you. There's a difference. The distinction felt like a lifeline Frank didn't deserve. Before he could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Detective Linda Hayes, Red Haven PD. She carried herself with the controlled competence of someone who'd earned her badge the hard way. Late 30s, wedding ring on her left hand worn enough to show years of marriage. Ms. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Sarah straightened, shifted into professional mode. Frank recognized the transformation. Military bearing that separated personal trauma from duty. He'd worn that mask often enough himself. I saw someone pointing a gun at Marcus Brennan. I reacted. That's all. Linda pulled out a notebook, pen poised. You saw the shooter before he fired? Yes. Can you describe him? Sarah provided details with the precision of someone trained in observation. Height, weight, clothing, the way he held the weapon. Amateur, scared. His hands were shaking. Linda made notes. Marcus says you're former Coast Guard, search and rescue. 13 years. And you happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment to save his life. The implication hung in the air. Sarah's expression hardened. I was shopping, walking home, wrong place, right time, or right place, right time. Depends on your perspective. Linda's gaze shifted to Frank. And you're her father. Frank Mitchell. I live here. Have for 10 years. The detective's eyes narrowed. Frank Mitchell, Gears. Steel Wolves founding member. Used to be, 20 years ago. I'm a carpenter now. But you still have connections. Still have friends in the club. I have one friend who still talks to me. Everyone else thinks I betrayed them when I walked away. Frank kept his voice neutral, stating facts without emotion. Someone tried to kill Marcus Brennan. My daughter got shot stopping it. If you think I'm involved, you're wasting time. You could spend finding the actual shooter. Linda closed her notebook. I don't think you're involved, but I know motorcycle club politics. This won't end with one bullet. Whatever Victor Castellano has planned, this was just the opening move. She left. The door swung shut. Frank and Sarah sat in silence, processing the weight of being carried in something neither of them had chosen. Sarah spoke first. You should go home. I can take care of myself. I know you can. Frank stood, every year of his age making itself known. But I'm not leaving. Not this time. Sarah's resistance crumbled slightly. She looked young suddenly, younger than 35, looking like the 6-year-old who'd ridden on the back of his bike and felt safe because her father was a warrior who'd always protect her. The nurse came to discharge Sarah. Frank handled the paperwork, drove her to the apartment she'd never told him she had. They didn't speak during the drive. Words felt inadequate for the distance they needed to cross. He walked her to her door, made sure she got inside safely, turned to leave. Dad. Sarah's voice stopped him on the threshold. He looked back. She stood in her doorway, wounded and exhausted, and maybe willing to believe he might still be someone worth knowing. Thank you for being there today. Frank nodded, couldn't trust his voice not to break. He walked to his truck, climbed in, sat behind the wheel while his hands shook with adrenaline, finally released. His daughter had taken a bullet. His daughter who he'd failed so completely that she'd moved to the same town without telling him. Who'd built a life he knew nothing about. Who'd reminded him today that warriors protected people, even when the cost was blood and pain. His phone buzzed. Text from Gunner, meeting tonight. Clubhouse. Be there. Frank stared at the message. 20 years since he'd set foot in the Steel Wolves clubhouse. 20 years since he'd worn the patch that defined who he was before he tried to be someone else. He typed back, I'm not a member anymore. Gunner's response came immediately. You're always a member. We need you. Marcus needs you. And that kid your daughter saved? He needs you too. Because if we don't handle this right, Red Haven burns. Frank started his truck. The engine rumbled to life, familiar and comforting. He pulled out of the apartment complex, pointed himself toward the east side of town where the clubhouse waited. Where men who'd once called him brother might still remember who he used to be. Where maybe for one more night, Frank Mitchell could stop being the man who'd failed everyone and become Gears again. The warrior who'd survived Kaysan, the founder who'd built something worth protecting, the father who'd do anything to keep his daughter safe, even if it meant walking back into the world he'd abandoned. The sun was setting over Red Haven, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Frank of tracer fire and burning buildings. Beautiful and terrible, like most things worth remembering. He drove toward the gathering storm with the windows down and the October wind carrying the smell of salt water and coming rain. Somewhere in this town, Dylan Cross was hiding. Somewhere, Victor Castellano was planning his next move. And somewhere between the past Frank couldn't change and the future he couldn't predict, there might be space for redemption he hadn't earned but desperately needed. The clubhouse appeared ahead, bikes already gathering in the parking lot. 50, maybe 60 machines. Word had spread fast. Steel Wolves were mobilizing. Frank pulled in, killed his engine, sat for a moment gathering himself. Then he dismounted and walked toward the door where Gunner Pete Walsh stood waiting. The old man's face split into a grin that took decades off his weathered features. Gears. About damn time you came home. The Steel Wolves clubhouse smelled like motor oil and history. Frank crossed the threshold for the first time in 2 decades, his boots echoing on concrete that bore the stains of half a century's worth of work and brotherhood. The interior hadn't changed much. Same scarred wooden table dominating the center. Same American flag on the wall beside the club charter, framed and yellowed with age. Same sense of purpose that civilian spaces never quite captured. Riders filled the room, maybe 40 men ranging from their 20s to Gunner's 68 years. 3 generations of warriors who'd found their way to the Steel Wolves for the same reason Frank had in 1972. Because the civilian world didn't understand what they carried. Because brotherhood forged in danger lasted longer than any peace treaty or discharge papers. Conversations died as Frank entered. Every eye tracked him. The prodigal founder. The man who'd walked away when Jack Brennan needed him most. Frank felt the weight of their judgment and accepted it as deserved. He'd chosen his family over his brothers. That choice had consequences that outlasted the marriage it was meant to save. Marcus stood at the head of the table, maps and photographs spread before him. He met Frank's gaze across the room and nodded once. Permission granted. Frank moved to stand beside Gunner while the younger members processed this ghost from their club's founding era. Rex Stone leaned against the wall, arms crossed, skepticism carved into every line of his posture. This is the guy, the legend who abandoned ship. Frank turned to face the vice president. No anger, just acknowledgement of truth. That's right, I left when the club needed me. Left because my wife gave me an ultimatum I couldn't refuse. Made the wrong choice about how to make it. Rex pushed off the wall. And now you're back because... Because someone shot my daughter today. Because that bullet was meant for your president. And because the kid who pulled the trigger is connected to a promise I made 53 years ago in a firebase outside Da Nang. The room processed this information in silence. Gunnar moved to the table, pulled out a chair for Frank. Sat. You've earned it. Frank sat. His knees thanked him. Marcus remained standing, command presence holding the room's attention. Dylan Cross, 28 years old, Shadow Serpents prospect. No serious priors beyond gambling debts. Lives with his sister in a rental on the east side. Marcus tapped a photo on the table. He aimed at me and hit a woman with no connection to any of this. That changes things. Tank Morrison spoke from his position by the door. We know where he holes up. Got 3 possibles. His apartment, his sister's work, and a warehouse on Dock Street his cousin owns. Rex pointed to locations marked on the map. We hit all 3 simultaneously. Find him. Find out who sent him. Frank studied the map with eyes that had planned ambushes and assaults across Vietnamese jungle and American streets. The tactical approach was sound but incomplete. Something nagged at his instincts. You're moving too fast, treating this like a smash and grab. Rex's jaw tightened. We need answers. Clock's ticking. Frank traced a finger along the routes between locations. In Vietnam, when we needed intel, speed wasn't the priority. Reading the terrain was. Understanding the enemy's mindset, he looked up at Marcus. This kid took a shot at you in broad daylight on Main Street. That's suicide level stupid or desperation level crazy. Either way, he's not thinking tactically. He's reacting. So what's your play? Marcus leaned forward, genuine interest overriding any defensive posturing. We control the terrain first. Frank stood, moved to the map, pointed. East End has 8 major intersections. We position bikes at each one, not to block, just to observe. Then we send a small team to each location. Not to breach, just to verify presence. Once we know where he is, we approach carefully. Because if he's desperate enough to shoot at you once, he's desperate enough to do it again when cornered. The younger members exchanged glances. This wasn't the overwhelming force approach they'd expected. Gunner's approving nod carried weight that transcended rank or patch. That's exactly how Jack would have done it. The old man's voice held certainty born from decades of shared experience. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and nobody dies because we rushed. Marcus made the decision. We do it Gears' way. Rex, coordinate positions at the intersections. Tank, pick your entry teams. 3 men each, experienced riders who won't spook at shadows. He checked his watch. We have maybe 2 hours before word spreads and Cross goes to ground deeper. The room mobilized with practiced efficiency. Frank found himself drawn into planning sessions, muscle memory from his founding years overriding the civilian mindset he'd worn for 2 decades. Radio frequencies, hand signals, extraction routes if things went sideways. The language of coordinated operations came back like riding a bicycle. Gunner appeared at his elbow with 2 bottles of water, handed one to Frank. You look like you're 19 again. Planning firebase defense. Frank drank, throat suddenly drawn. Feels like it too, except my back hurts and my knees don't bend right, and I'm old enough to know better. Age is just how long you've been doing it wrong. Gunner grinned. We're not young, but we're not dead either. And that kid Dylan, he needs old warriors like us. Warriors who remember that mercy is strength, not weakness. The teams formed up. Frank moved toward the door with the reconnaissance group, then stopped. His place wasn't in the field anymore. His place was supporting from the rear, using experience to guide younger men who had the speed and stamina he'd traded for wisdom. Marcus intercepted him. You ride with me. I want your eyes on this, your instincts. Frank started to protest, but Marcus's expression allowed no debate. You're the link to Tommy Cross, to Dylan's grandfather, that matters. Not just tactically, morally, we're not hunting a criminal. We're trying to understand a desperate man. The insight showed why Marcus had earned his father's legacy. Jack Brennan had understood that strength without compassion was just violence. His son had learned that lesson well. They mounted up, 60 bikes, maybe more. Members from neighboring chapters had rolled in after hearing about the attempt on Marcus's life. The convoy split into teams with military precision, each group heading toward their assigned positions. Frank rode behind Marcus on a borrowed Harley, the vibration through the frame familiar as breathing. The sun had set fully now, Red Haven transforming into pools of streetlight separated by shadows. October night carried the taste of salt from the Pacific and the promise of rain before dawn. Frank's mind overlaid the present with memories of night operations in Southeast Asia. Different terrain, same tension, same awareness that violence waited just beyond the next turn. His phone buzzed, text from Sarah. "Where are you?" Frank typed one-handed, awkward but determined. "With Steel Wolves, looking for the shooter." Her response came quickly. "You're 65 years old," he smiled despite everything, "and you're 35 with a bullet hole. We're both too stubborn to stay home." Three dots indicating she was typing. Then, "Be careful, please." The please carried weight that squeezed Frank's chest. His daughter, who hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, asking him to be careful. Progress measured in syllables. Always. He sent it before he could overthink. Then added, "You too. Lock your doors." The convoy rolled into the East End, bikes dispersing to predetermined positions. Frank and Marcus continued toward the warehouse on Dock Street, joined by Tank and two younger members whose patches identified them as Afghanistan veterans. The building loomed ahead, a rusted corrugated steel structure that had seen better decades. Marcus killed his engine 2 blocks out. The others followed suit. Silence settled over the street, broken only by distant traffic and the lap of water against pilings. Frank dismounted, ignored his knee's protest, moved with the group toward a position that offered sight lines on the warehouse's main entrance. Tank produced binoculars, scanned the building. Movement. Second floor, west side. Someone's up there. Marcus keyed his radio. "All teams, report." The responses came back. No activity at the apartment. No one at the sisters' workplace. Everything was concentrating here. Frank studied the warehouse with eyes that had learned to read terrain under hostile conditions. Single exit visible from this angle. But buildings like this usually had a back door for loading. Fire exits, ways out that desperate men would remember when cornered. He's got an escape route planned. Frank kept his voice low. "If we approach from the front, he runs out the back, so we cover the back." Tank started to move, but Frank caught his arm. "No, we make him think he has an escape. Let him feel like he's got options. People make better decisions when they're not trapped." Marcus considered this. "You want to let him run?" "I want to let him think he can run. Then we talk to him before he does. Show him there's another way." The approach was antithetical to every tactical doctrine Frank had learned in Vietnam or with the Steel Wolves. But Dylan Cross wasn't the enemy. He was a scared kid who'd made terrible choices for reasons they didn't yet understand. Treating him like an enemy would only confirm whatever narrative had put a gun in his hand. Tank positioned himself and his team to cover the rear exit, visible enough that Dylan would see them if he looked but far enough back to avoid being immediately threatening. Frank and Marcus approached the front entrance, their boots crunching on gravel that announced their presence. The warehouse door stood ajar. Light filtered from somewhere inside, dim and yellowish. Frank's training screamed ambush. Every instinct demanded caution. But instinct could also create the very violence you were trying to avoid. "Dylan Cross," Frank's voice carried through the doorway, firm but not aggressive. "My name is Frank Mitchell. I served with your grandfather. Tommy Cross, I need to talk to you." Silence. Then footsteps, rapid and panicked. The sound of someone knocking into something in the dark. Frank entered, let his eyes adjust, tracked movement toward the back of the warehouse's open floor plan. Dylan stood near a rear door, visible now in the spill of light from a battery-powered lantern. Late 20s, thin in the way that suggested missed meals and stress. He held a pistol, the same weapon he'd fired on Pine Street. His hands shook badly enough that Frank could see the tremor from 30 feet away. "Stay back," Dylan's voice cracked. "I'll shoot." Marcus remained in the doorway, hands visible and empty. Frank took 2 slow steps forward. "You already shot someone today." "You hit a woman named Sarah Mitchell." "My daughter." He paused, let that sink in. She pushed Marcus out of the way and took the bullet meant for him. You know what she did after? She stood up, walked to the ambulance. Didn't cry, didn't scream. She's Coast Guard. 13 years search and rescue. Trained to save people even when saving them cost blood. Dylan's gun lowered slightly. I didn't mean to hit her. I wasn't trying to hit anyone. I just needed them to think I tried. Frank took another step. Your grandfather would understand that. Tommy Cross was a good Marine, a good man. He didn't want to kill anyone in Vietnam either. But sometimes good men get put in impossible positions. You knew him? Dylan's voice carried desperate hope that someone could validate the grandfather he'd never met. Frank reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out his wallet, withdrew a photograph he'd carried for 53 years. Black and white, creased and faded. 8 Marines on a fire base, young and alive and unaware that 3 of them wouldn't make it home. He held it out. That's him, 4th from the left. Tommy Cross, Lance Corporal, 18 years old. He showed me pictures of his wife and baby boy. Your father, I'm guessing, talked about them every chance he got. Dylan crossed the space between them before thought could override need. Took the photograph with his free hand, the gun forgotten as he stared at a grandfather he'd only known through stories. Tears tracked down his face. He died saving me. Frank's voice roughened with memory. April 7th, 1971. We were pinned down by NVA fire outside Khe Sanh. Tommy pulled me to cover. Took shrapnel from an RPG that would have killed me. I held his hand while he died. Last thing he said was, "Tell my boy I tried to be good." I promised I would. Then I came home so messed up I couldn't keep that promise. Couldn't keep any promises. Dylan looked up from the photograph. So you failed him too. The accusation landed without malice, just exhausted recognition of shared failure. Frank nodded. Yes, I failed him. Failed a lot of people. Spent 50 years trying to make up for it. Never quite managed. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to tell me why you tried to kill Marcus Brennan. Because I know Tommy Cross raised his son to be better than this, which means your father raised you to be better than this. So something went very wrong. The gun fell from Dylan's hand, clattered on concrete. He crumpled, back sliding down the wall until he sat on the filthy floor. The whole story poured out in broken sentences and suppressed sobs. Gambling debts he couldn't pay. Loan sharks connected to shadow serpents. His sister Melissa, 19 years old, college student, grabbed on her way to class. Victor Castellano's voice on the phone. Kill Marcus Brennan or your sister dies screaming. Dylan had never fired a gun before yesterday, didn't know how to aim, how to breathe, how to accept that he was about to murder someone. So I aimed high, figured if I missed but fired the shot, maybe it would buy time. Maybe I could figure out another way. Then your daughter, he looked at Frank with anguish. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Marcus stepped fully into the warehouse. Where's your sister now? Serpent's compound. East side. Old industrial building they use as headquarters. He gave the address, the access codes, the number of guards. Everything spilled out with the relief of someone who'd been carrying too much weight alone. Frank helped Dylan to his feet. Your grandfather made a mistake in Vietnam, got separated from his unit during a patrol, walked right into an ambush. But he owned it, stood up, drew fire to give the rest of us time to get in position, took his mistake and turned it into sacrifice. That's what heroes do. They don't avoid mistakes, they own them and try to make them right. How do I make this right? You help us get your sister back. You testify against Castellano. You take responsibility for what you did. Frank met the young man's eyes. It won't be easy, but your grandfather didn't raise a coward. Neither did your father. Time to prove it. Dylan nodded, picked up the gun, handed it to Marcus, gripped first in a gesture of surrender. Whatever you need, just save Melissa. Marcus took the weapon, cleared it with practiced efficiency. We're not leaving her there, but we do this smart. My father used to say, violence is easy, justice is hard. We choose hard. The ride back to the clubhouse happened in silence. Dylan sat on the back of Tank's bike, hands zip-tied in front as insurance against second thoughts. Frank processed what they'd learned. Victor Castellano had orchestrated this entire situation, forced a desperate kid to attempt murder, knowing it would provoke response from steel wolves. The question was why? What did Viper gain from engineering conflict? The clubhouse buzzed with energy when they arrived. Dylan was secured in a back room, not imprisoned, but protected. Marcus called his inner circle together while Frank stood at the edge, observer rather than participant. Old habits reasserting themselves. He'd given up his right to be part of these decisions 20 years ago. Gunnar pulled him aside. Stop standing in the corner like a ghost. You're one of us again, whether you accept it or not. I walked away. And now you're back. Doesn't matter what you call it. Brotherhood isn't something you resign from. It's something you are. Gunnar's certainty carried the weight of someone who'd buried too many friends to waste time on grudges. Jack died angry at you. I won't. Life's too short. The statement cracked something in Frank's chest. He'd expected judgment, received forgiveness instead. The contradiction left him unmoored. Marcus spread new intel on the table. Compound layout, guard positions. Melissa's probable location based on Dylan's information. Rex argued for overwhelming force. Tank wanted tactical precision. The debate circled without resolution until Marcus raised a hand for silence. Gears, what's your read? Every eye turned to Frank. He moved to the table, studied the layout with assessment born from decades of planning operations in hostile territory. The compound occupied a full city block surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. 2 entrances, guards at both. The building itself was 3 stories, industrial concrete, windows covered with plywood or bars. This isn't a smash and grab. Frank traced possible approach routes. We go in loud, Melissa becomes a hostage or worse. We need small team insertion. Extract the girl clean. Get out before they know we're there. How many men? Marcus leaned forward. 4, maybe 5. All with military experience. All comfortable moving in hostile environments. We go in dark. We move fast. We get the girl and extract. He looked up. Meanwhile, the rest of you make noise somewhere else. Diversion. Pull guards away from interior positions. Rex shook his head. You're asking us to split force. Tactical nightmare if things go sideways. Things already went sideways when Viper grabbed a college student. Frank's voice carried an edge. Now we're in damage control. Question is whether we're willing to take smart risks to save an innocent, or whether we let fear of failure stop us from doing what's right. The challenge hung in the air. These were men who'd faced worse odds in worse places. Fear didn't drive their decisions. Caution did. The difference mattered. I'll go. Marcus's declaration settled it. My club, my responsibility. Frank opened his mouth to argue, to say that club presidents didn't take point on high-risk extractions. But he recognized the determined set of Marcus's jaw. Recognized it because he'd worn that same expression in Vietnam when everyone told him tunnel clearing was suicide duty for the smallest guy in the unit. I'm going too. Frank's words surprised himself almost as much as they surprised the room. I made a promise to Tommy Cross. His grandson's sister is trapped because of that failure. I fix this or I die trying. You're 65 years old. Rex's objection carried practical concern, not insult. And I cleared tunnels when I was 19. Age doesn't erase training, it adds experience. Frank straightened. Besides, someone needs to make sure your president doesn't get shot because he's too young to be properly paranoid. Laughter broke the tension. Marcus grinned. All right, me, Gears, Tank, and 2 more. Who's got small unit experience? 2 younger members stepped forward, Afghan veterans with special operations backgrounds. They'd know how to move quietly, how to communicate without words, how to turn chaos into controlled violence if extraction went wrong. The plan crystallized. Main force would gather on the compound's west side, make noise, demand Melissa's release, create spectacle. Police would respond, which was part of the calculation. Attention focused away from the east side where the extraction team would breach through a weak point in the fence Dylan had identified. Timing was critical. They had to move before dawn, before Viper realized they'd captured Dylan and adjusted his security. That gave them maybe 4 hours to prep and execute. Frank excused himself, stepped outside to call Sarah. She answered on the second ring. Dad? Her voice carried worry that made his chest tight. We found the shooter, kid named Dylan Cross. He's Tommy's grandson. The pause stretched. Tommy, who you served with? Same one, long story. But the important part is we're getting his sister out of Shadow Serpent's custody tonight. I'm going with the extraction team. You're, what? Sarah's tone shifted from worry to anger. You're 65 years old with a bad back and you're planning to assault a criminal compound? I'm 65 years old with more tactical experience than anyone in this room except Gunner, and he's older than I am. Frank kept his voice calm. That girl is 19. Same age you were when you joined Coast Guard. Someone has to stand between her and men who'd hurt her. I've got the skills and the moral obligation. Both matter. Dad, please. You could die. The vulnerability in her voice broke through walls they'd both built. Frank closed his eyes. I've been dying for 20 years. Slowly, one day of regret at a time. Tonight I get to live. Get to be the man I was before I let fear and guilt turn me into someone neither of us recognized. Your mother asked me to give up the club. I did. But I never stopped being the Marine who understood that some fights matter. This one matters. Silence on the line. Then, come home safe. I will. He wanted to say more, wanted to bridge 20 years of distance with words he'd never learned to speak. I'm proud of you, Sarah, what you did today. That took more courage than anything I've done since Vietnam. Her breath caught. I learned it from watching you, before you left the club, before you became someone else. I remember the man who'd stand between danger and anyone who needed protecting. Today I tried to be that person. Maybe I'm more your daughter than I wanted to admit. The admission cost her. Frank heard it in the tremor beneath her words. Maybe we're both more alike than we wanted to be, but that's not the worst thing. Being a warrior isn't about violence. It's about standing up when standing up is hard. He ended the call before emotion could fracture his voice entirely. Turned to find Gunner watching from the doorway. She's a good kid, tough like her old man. Her old man is a disaster who abandoned everyone who mattered. Gunner moved beside him, both of them staring out at the parking lot full of motorcycles. Your old man survived 3 tours in Vietnam, built a brotherhood that's lasted 50 years, and raised a daughter who throws herself in front of bullets to save strangers. You didn't abandon anyone. You tried to be 2 different people at once. That's not abandonment. That's impossible math. The absolution came easier from Gunner than Frank's own conscience allowed. He'd spent 2 decades viewing his choices through the lens of failure. Maybe it was time to consider that he'd done the best he could with bad options and insufficient wisdom. The compound raid was scheduled for 3 a.m. Optimal timing for assault operations. Guards would be tired. Civilians would be asleep. Response times would be slower. The teams geared up with the efficiency of men who'd done this before in places where mistakes meant death. Frank pulled on borrowed tactical gear that fit poorly across his broader, older frame. Checked the radio, reviewed the floor plan one final time. His back already ached, and they hadn't started yet. It was a betrayal of readiness, but experience compensated where physical capability had declined. Marcus approached, handed him a vest. Kevlar. Won't stop rifle rounds, but it might save you from handguns. Frank accepted it. Been a long time since I wore body armor. Doesn't fit as well when you're not 20 anymore. Marcus grinned, but neither do our ideals. We're older, wiser, maybe better, or maybe just more aware of what we have to lose. You sound like your father. That's a compliment. He would have liked this. You being here. Would never have admitted it, but he regretted the way things ended between you. The statement opened old wounds that had never properly healed. Frank had carried Jack's anger like a stone in his chest. The possibility that some of that anger might have softened before death offered comfort and complication in equal measure. The convoy rolled out at 2:45 a.m. 40 bikes heading east, engines throttled low to minimize noise. Frank rode behind Marcus again, the vibration through the frame familiar now. His mind wandered to other night operations, other missions where the stakes involved lives that couldn't be replaced. April 1971, Firebase under siege. Frank crawling through pitch darkness to reach wounded Marines pinned down by machine gun fire. Tommy crossed beside him, both of them 19 years old and absolutely certain they were invincible, right up until shrapnel proved otherwise. October 2024. Red Haven streets empty except for the river of steel and leather flowing toward confrontation. Frank's 65 years old and absolutely certain he was expendable, which made him more dangerous than men who still believed they had something to lose. The compound appeared ahead, industrial and ugly in the sodium streetlights. The main force positioned themselves at the west entrance, engines rumbling loud enough to wake the dead. Demand for Melissa's release. Negotiation that wasn't meant to succeed. Theater to draw attention. Frank's team peeled off, circled to the east side, found the section of fence Dylan had identified, cut recently and poorly repaired. Tank produced wire cutters, snipped the remaining connections. The fence peeled back. They slipped through. The building loomed massive in the darkness. Frank's heart hammered hard enough that he worried the others could hear it. Age made you aware of mortality, every breath a gift you'd taken for granted at 19. He pushed the fear down, channeled it into heightened awareness. They moved along the wall, staying in shadows. Tank took point, Frank covered rear. The two Afghan vets worked the middle, weapons ready but not raised. Professional, controlled. Exactly what this situation required. A side door stood ajar. Smoking area, probably. Serpent's guards too lazy to fully close it when they stepped out for cigarettes. The team breached, moving from exterior darkness into interior dimness, lit by emergency exit signs and scattered workbenches. The layout matched Dylan's description. First floor was open workspace. Second floor had offices. Third floor had living quarters where Melissa was probably being held. They found stairs, ascended with care. Each step a potential betrayal, old wood creaking under boots that tried to distribute weight silently. Frank's back seized at the second floor landing. Muscle spasm that locked his spine and sent pain radiating down both legs. He froze, jaw clenched, willing his body to cooperate. Not now. Not when people were counting on him. Marcus turned back, saw the situation, touched Frank's shoulder. 1 minute. We have time. The kindness nearly broke him. Frank breathed through the spasm, used techniques the VA had taught him for managing chronic pain. Slowly his muscles released. He nodded. Good to go. Third floor. Hallway with doors on both sides. They moved room to room, clearing each space. Empty. Empty. Storage. Empty. Then Tank raised a fist. Found her. Melissa Cross sat on a cot in a room that smelled like mold and fear. 19 years old with her brother's same dark hair and frightened eyes. Duct tape over her mouth, zip ties on her wrists. She saw them and panic flared before Tank raised his hands in universal gesture of friend, not foe. Marcus moved to her, knife out to cut the restraints. Melissa, your brother sent us. We're getting you out. The tape came off. She gasped. Dylan, he's okay? He's safe, so will you be? 3 minutes and we're gone. But the universe didn't grant them 3 minutes. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Voices raised. The main force's diversion had drawn too much attention or not enough. Either what's banning on they'd been spotted. Tank moved to the door, weapon up. Contact. 4, maybe 5. Frank positioned himself between Melissa and the threat. Felt his training click into place over age and injury. You don't forget how to fight. You just forget you remember until the moment demands it. The hallway erupted. Not gunfire, thankfully. Hand to hand as Serpent's guards realized the intruders weren't supposed to be there. Tank met the first one with precision brutality honed in Kandahar. Marcus took the second. The Afghan vets handled third and fourth. The fifth broke through, younger and faster than expected. Came straight at Frank with a knife in bad intentions. Frank's body moved on autopilot, sidestepped the thrust, caught the wrist, applied pressure that sent the knife clattering, swept the leg, put the man down hard. Then his back went out completely. Not a spasm this time, but something structural giving way. Frank gasped, nearly fell. The young Serpent saw opportunity, started to rise. Melissa swung a lamp she'd grabbed from somewhere, connected with the Serpent's head. He dropped, unconscious. She stood over him, breathing hard, frightened but functional. Tank helped Frank upright. Can you move? Have to. They got Melissa between them, Marcus and the vets providing security. The extraction became a fighting retreat, every step carefully managed around Frank's compromised mobility. Down the stairs, through the first floor, out the side door. Sirens split the night, red and blue lights converging from multiple directions. Linda Hayes had excellent timing. the cavalry arriving just as the extraction team hit the street. The main force of steel wolves blocked the compound's main entrance, creating wall of leather and chrome that prevented serpents from pursuing. Police moved in, separating combatants. Frank saw Detective Hayes directing her officers with the confidence of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. Marcus got Melissa to a bike. She rode behind one of the vets, arms wrapped tight, heading for safety. Frank leaned against a wall, back screaming, victory tasting like copper and exhaustion. Linda approached. "Mr. Mitchell, you look like hell. Feel worse. But the girl's safe. The girl is evidence in a kidnapping case, which means I need statements from everyone involved." She fixed him with a look that suggested she knew exactly how questionable tonight's operation had been. "But since you handed me probable cause for the RICO case I've been building against Castellano for 8 months, I'm willing to be creative about how I write this up." Frank straightened despite his back's protest. "You were building a case? For almost a year. But these motorcycle clubs are tight. Hard to get anyone to flip. Then tonight happens. Kidnapping, assault, extortion, all documented, all witnessed." She almost smiled. "Your grandson's testimony will be the keystone. Dylan's not my grandson." "No, but Tommy Cross was your brother, in the ways that matter. That makes Dylan family. And family testifies to protect each other." Red Haven Police Station at 6 a.m. looked like a motorcycle rally had collided with a bureaucracy. Steel wolves filled the waiting area, giving statements, drinking terrible coffee, watching sun rise through windows that needed cleaning. Frank sat in a hard plastic chair, back rigid because bending hurt worse than staying straight. Sarah appeared in the entrance, arms still in a sling, but present and furious. She crossed directly to him. "You're an idiot." No preamble, just truth spoken with the authority of someone who'd earned the right. "Probably." Frank looked up at his daughter. "But the girl is safe, that's what matters." Sarah sat beside him with care that suggested her own injury demanded respect. "Did you re-injure your back?" "Yeah, but I held it together when it counted." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom would have been terrified. Your mother was terrified every day I was with the club. Part of why she asked me to leave. But she married you knowing what you were. Knowing the warrior came with the man." Frank had spent 20 years trying to understand his wife's contradictions. Loved the man she met, couldn't live with what that man was. Tried to change him into someone safe. Resented him when the transformation made him miserable. She wanted both. Wanted me to be brave when it suited her and safe when it scared her to her. Couldn't be both. Learned that too late. Sarah's hand found his. "I blamed you for not being what she needed. Spent years angry at you for making her unhappy. But I'm starting to think maybe you couldn't make her happy because she wanted someone you weren't." The insight settled like balm on decades-old wounds. Frank squeezed his daughter's hand. "I loved her, even when loving her meant killing part of myself. That wasn't her fault. Wasn't mine either. Just bad math trying to make incompatible people add up to happiness." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Victor Castellano, in handcuffs, being led by two officers. Older man, late 60s, carrying himself with the rigid posture of someone desperately projecting authority he didn't naturally possess. Frank studied Viper with the assessment born from decades of reading Men Under Pressure. Something was wrong. The posture wasn't confidence. It was compensation. The aggression wasn't strength. It was covering weakness. Viper saw the assembled steel wolves and sneered. "Tough guys need 40 bikes to rescue one girl. Real impressive." Marcus stood. "One girl you kidnapped, one kid you forced to attempt murder, one organization you've been using to hurt this community." He moved closer. "We protect Red Haven. You prey on it. That's the difference between us. You're all the same. Bikers, outlaws, criminals in leather. You just have better PR." Frank rose, back screaming protest, crossed to stand beside Marcus. "I know what you are. Saw it the moment you walked in." Viper turned his sneer on Frank. "And what's that, old man?" "A faker. Someone who wore the uniform but never earned the respect. Someone who spent their whole life trying to prove they're tough because deep down they know they're not." How would you know? You don't know anything about me. Frank met his eyes. I know you're Vietnam era. Know the way you stand, the way you try to command space. And I know it's wrong. You weren't combat. Were you? The sneer cracked. Viper's face flushed. What unit? Frank pressed. What year? Where'd you serve? Supply clerk. Da Nang, 1970. The admission came out defensive. Still served, still wore the uniform. But you weren't in the jungle. Weren't in the firefights. Came home and told people you were a veteran, let them assume combat. Built a life on respect you didn't earn. That's why you're so angry. That's why you hurt people. Because somewhere inside, you know the difference. The accusation hung in the station. Viper lunged, but the officers held him back. Frank didn't flinch. Tommy Cross died at Khe Sanh in 1971. 19 years old, married, new baby. Gave his life protecting brothers. You were safe in a warehouse counting supplies. Both of you served. Only one of you was a warrior. That gap has been eating you for 53 years. Viper's rage transformed into something more honest. Anguish. The face of a man who'd spent half a century pretending to be something he wasn't, punishing everyone else for his own inadequacy. Linda stepped between them. That's enough. She signaled the officers, take him to processing. As they led Viper away, Frank felt no satisfaction. Just exhaustion and pity for a man who'd let insecurity curdle into cruelty. War created too many victims. Not just those who died or those who saw combat, also those who survived without ever proving themselves and spent their lives overcompensating. Marcus touched Frank's shoulder. That was brutal. That was mercy. Truth offered while he could still choose what to do with it. Prison might give him time to make peace with who he really is. Sarah moved to Frank's other side. How did you know? Because I spent 20 years pretending to be someone I wasn't. Recognize the signs. He looked at his daughter. Difference is I'm done pretending. Whether that makes me your father worth knowing or just an old biker who doesn't fit anywhere. At least it's honest. You fit here. With me, if you want. Sarah's offer came wrapped in the same vulnerability Frank had heard on the phone earlier. I want. More than anything. The station filled with morning light. Dylan gave a statement. Melissa reunited with her brother, both of them crying with relief and trauma and the beginning of healing. Steel Wolves members provided contact information. Accepted citations for various minor infractions Linda used to maintain the fiction that law enforcement was in control. Gunner found Frank in the crowd. You did good tonight, Gears. Your father would be proud. So would Tommy Cross. Just trying to pay old debts. Some debts don't expire. But you made a payment tonight that matters. Gunner gripped his shoulder. You coming back to the clubhouse? For the after action? Frank glanced at Sarah. She nodded permission. Go, I need to sleep anyway. But you're buying me breakfast tomorrow. You owe me that much. It's a deal. He watched her leave. His daughter who'd taken a bullet, who'd forgiven him by degrees, who might let him be part of her life if he didn't screw it up again. The Steel Wolves convoy rolled back toward the clubhouse as dawn painted Red Haven in shades of gold and pink. Frank rode with Marcus, his back a symphony of pain he'd worry about later. Right now, he was alive. Sarah was safe. Dylan was free. Melissa was rescued. The math added up to something that felt like purpose. At the clubhouse, members shared stories and exaggerations, the mission already transforming into legend. 3 generations of warriors finding common ground in successful operation against evil men. Frank stood at the edge, neither fully included nor excluded, somewhere between ghost and founder. Marcus raised his voice over the celebration. Tonight we showed what Steel Wolves stands for. Not violence, justice, not revenge, protection. He found Frank in the crowd. And we showed that founding principles don't expire. They just wait for the right moment to matter again. Applause. Frank accepted it with discomfort that softened into something that might become acceptance given time. He wasn't whole yet, wasn't forgiven by everyone. But he was here, present, contributing. After 20 years of exile, that was enough. Gunner handed him a beer. To Tommy Cross, to brotherhood, to old warriors who remember that mercy is strength. Frank raised the bottle. To second chances we don't deserve, but sometimes get anyway. They drank as sunrise turned morning into day. Red Haven woke around them, unaware that warriors had spent the night ensuring their safety. That was fine. Warriors didn't protect people for recognition. They protected people because someone had to, because evil needed opposition, because the alternative was letting darkness win by default. Frank finished his beer. His back hurt. His knees ached. His body cataloged every year of his 65. But his heart felt lighter than it had in 2 decades. Tonight he'd been gears again. Not the man who'd abandoned his brothers, not the civilian who'd failed his wife, just a warrior doing warrior things for warrior reasons. His phone buzzed. Text from Sarah. "Proud of you, Dad. Get some rest." He typed back carefully. "Proud of you too. Love you." The response came immediately. "Love you too." 3 words. 20 years of silence broken by 3 words. Frank closed his eyes, let the weight of reconciliation settle into spaces that had been empty for too long. He was home. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Sarah's apartment, softer than the harsh hospital fluorescence that had defined the previous day. She woke to the sound of her father moving in the kitchen, the smell of coffee reaching her before consciousness fully returned. The domesticity felt foreign after 5 years of silence and 3 years of living alone in a town she hadn't known he shared. Sarah's arm throbbed beneath fresh bandages. The wound had bled through during the night, staining sheets she'd need to wash. Small price for being alive. Smaller still for the fragile bridge being rebuilt between her and the man who'd raised her in the spaces between his other life. Frank appeared in the doorway, 2 mugs in hand. "Didn't know if you still took it black." She sat up carefully, accepted the offering. Some things don't change. He settled into the chair by her window, the one she used for reading books she never finished. His face carried the exhaustion of a night spent in violence and revelation. 65 years compressed into lines and gray that made him look older than yesterday, younger than the decade of misery that had followed his exit from the Steel Wolves. "Your back's worse." Sarah made its statement, not question. Frank sipped his coffee, didn't deny what his posture already confirmed. Price of admission. Hasn't been that bad in years. Worth it to get that girl home. Mom would have lost her mind if she'd known what you did last night. The mention of her mother settled between them like a third presence. Frank's expression softened with memory and regret braided together too tightly to separate. "Your mother loved a version of me that never really existed. The warrior she met was exciting. The man who came home from the club covered in grease and whiskey scared her. She wanted the strength without the danger, the protection without the violence." He set his mug down. "Can't have one without the other. Took me too long to understand that." Sarah had spent years blaming her father for her mother's unhappiness. Simple math that made one parent the villain and one the victim. Age and her own trauma had complicated that equation beyond easy solutions. When I joined the Coast Guard, I told myself it was to serve, to be better than you were. She looked at the steam rising from her coffee. "But really I was running. From watching you suffocate trying to be normal. From knowing that maybe I was more like you than like her." "You're exactly like me." Frank's voice carried pride instead of apology. "Can't see someone in danger without acting. Can't let injustice stand without challenging it. That's not learned behavior. That's who you are." The validation cracked something in Sarah's chest. Her whole adult life had been constructed around being her father's opposite. Discovering she'd only been proving his point felt like whiplash and relief simultaneously. "What happens now? With the club? With you?" Frank stood, moved to the window. Watched Red Haven wake up outside. Ordinary people starting ordinary days unaware that warriors had spent the night keeping them safe. "Marcus offered me a place, not full member, too much history for that. But advisor, elder statesman, someone the younger guys can learn from." He glanced back. "I said yes, if you're okay with it. Why would my opinion matter? Because you're my daughter. Because I spent 20 years making choices based on what other people needed instead of what felt right. Not making that mistake again. If having me back in that world bothers you, I'll walk away." Sarah processed this. Her father, asking permission, giving her veto power over the identity he'd suppressed for 2 decades. The gesture meant more than he probably understood. "You were happier there, even when it was dangerous, even when Mom hated it." The words came easier than expected. "I saw you last night. At the clubhouse. You were alive in a way I hadn't seen since I was 6 years old, she met his eyes. Don't walk away from that again. Not for me, not for anyone. Relief washed across Frank's weathered face. Your mother asked me to choose. You're telling me I can be both. Father and warrior. You've always been both. You just tried to hide half of it. That's what made you miserable. The conversation felt like exorcism. Years of resentment and misunderstanding bleeding out through honesty they'd both been too afraid to attempt. Frank moved back to his chair. There's something else. The crib I've been building. He hesitated, vulnerability making him look younger despite his age. Heard through the grapevine you're pregnant, 3 months along. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, still flat enough that the pregnancy remained invisible to casual observation. She'd planned to tell him eventually. Eventually had been pushed forward by circumstances neither of them controlled. How did you... Small town. Friend who works at the clinic mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Gunnar. He paused. I know the father isn't in the picture. Know you're planning to do this alone. But you don't have to be alone. Not if you don't want to be. Tears surprised Sarah with their sudden arrival. Hormones and exhaustion and 3 years of isolation cracking open all at once. I don't know how to do this. Be a mother. Raise a kid by myself. Your mother raised you mostly by herself. I was physically present but emotionally absent. You turned out pretty remarkable despite having a father who didn't know how to show up properly. I'm scared. The admission cost her. I'm scared I'll fail this baby the way I failed my team. Frank leaned forward, reached across the space between them to take her hand. You didn't fail your team. You faced impossible conditions and did everything humanly possible. The ocean doesn't care about courage or training or good intentions. Sometimes people die despite your best efforts. That's tragedy, not failure. How do you know the difference? Because I've carried both. Failure is when you had options and chose wrong. Tragedy is when there were no good options and you chose anyway. Your team? That was tragedy. But this baby? He squeezed her hand. This is your chance to get it right. And I'll be there however you need me, whatever that looks like. The promise settled into spaces Sarah hadn't realized were empty. She'd been planning single motherhood with the grim determination of someone expecting to do everything alone. Having backup felt like oxygen after years of holding her breath. What if I mess it up? Then you mess it up and try again tomorrow. That's parenting. Frank smiled. That's life. None of us get it right the first time, or the second, or the 20th. We just keep showing up. The knock on Sarah's door 3 days later came with authority that suggested law enforcement or worse. She answered to find Detective Linda Hayes, expression grim. Can I come in? Sarah stepped aside. Linda entered, swept the apartment with eyes that cataloged exits and threats out of habit, sat on the couch without invitation. Victor Castellano posted bail this morning. The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah's hand moved to her bandaged arm, phantom pain flaring. How? He was facing kidnapping charges. Extortion, attempted murder, anonymous donor, 2 million K. Linda's frustration bled through professional composure. Judge set bail high enough that Viper shouldn't have been able to touch it. Someone with deep pockets wants him on the street. Why are you telling me? Shouldn't you be warning Marcus? Already did, but you're the one who took the bullet. You're the wild card Viper didn't plan for. That makes you dangerous to whatever he's planning next. Sarah processed threat assessment with training that predated her time in Red Haven. Anonymous donor, $2 million. Someone wanted Viper free for a reason. Someone with resources that extended beyond the Shadow Serpents organization. What aren't you telling me? Linda pulled out her phone, showed Sarah a still image from courthouse security footage. Viper leaving, smiling. Not the rage-filled man from his arrest. Something colder, more calculated. He made a call from the courthouse steps. 30 seconds. We couldn't trace it, but we got the audio. Linda played it. Viper's voice tinny through phone speakers. Plan B is in motion. Targets the old man and his daughter. Tonight, midnight. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. My father. And you. Linda met her eyes. We can offer protection, safe house until trial, but it'll be months, maybe longer. The suggestion carried logic Sarah's mind understood even as her gut rejected it. Hide. Let others handle the threat. Stay safe behind walls and armed guards. Everything she'd spent 13 years in the Coast Guard learning not to do. What about my father? Does he know? Marcus is telling him now. Linda stood. I need your answer in the next hour. After that, I can't guarantee we can move you safely. Sarah looked around her apartment. 3 years of carefully constructed solitude. Life built small enough that it couldn't hurt her when it fell apart. The baby growing inside her deserved better than a mother who solved problems by running away. No safe house. I'm staying. Ms. Mitchell, Sarah cut her off. Someone wants me scared enough to hide. Wants my father isolated enough to be vulnerable. We split up. We play into their hands. We stay together. We control the terrain. Linda's expression shifted from professional concern to reluctant respect. You sound like your father. Good. Maybe I'm finally learning the right lessons. After Linda left, Sarah called Frank. He answered on the first ring. Already knew what she was going to say before she spoke. Marcus told me. About Viper. About the threat. We should stay together. Your place or mine, but not separated. My workshop. Frank's voice carried the calm of someone who'd already run threat assessments and chosen his ground. More space, better sight lines, tools that double as weapons if needed. Plus, I've got the crib almost finished. Might as well get your opinion on it. The casualness of the last statement almost made Sarah laugh. Her father planning defense against criminal threats while worrying about furniture opinions. Peak Frank Mitchell logic. I'll be there in an hour. She packed essentials. Changed into clothes that allowed movement. Checked the pistol she'd kept from her Coast Guard service and rarely touched. The weight felt foreign and familiar simultaneously. Sarah had qualified expert marksman, but had never fired at a human target. Might need to tonight. The possibility sat heavy in her chest. The drive to Frank's property took 20 minutes through Red Haven afternoon traffic. His workshop occupied 5 acres on the outskirts of town, part of the original homestead he'd bought with money earned from decades of carpentry. The main house was modest. The workshop was cathedral-like, timber frame construction with tools organized with military precision. Frank met her at the door. His shovel head was parked nearby, chrome gleaming in autumn sun. Other motorcycles lined the gravel drive. Steel Wolf's presence. Marcus had mobilized security whether Frank wanted it or not. Inside the workshop, the crib stood on sawhorses. Cherry wood, hand-carved details. Joints so perfect they looked like single pieces rather than assembled components. Sarah touched the rail, felt the love her father had poured into every cut and sanded edge. It's beautiful. Frank stood beside her, both of them studying the furniture built for a grandchild he might never hold. Your mother would have loved being a grandmother. Would have been good at it. Better than she was at being married to me. The observation carried no bitterness. Just acknowledgement of truths they'd both avoided for too long. Sarah leaned against the workbench, fatigue catching up to adrenaline and emotion. Tell me about her. Before me, when you first met. Frank pulled up a stool, settled with the careful movement of someone managing chronic pain. We met in 1973. I'd been back from Vietnam 2 years, founding the Steel Wolves with your Uncle Jack. Your mother was waitressing at a diner we'd stop at after rides. He smiled at the memory. She had this way of looking at me, like she saw past the leather and the bike to something worth saving underneath. What did she see? A broken Marine who needed someone to believe he could be more than his damage. Frank's expression turned distant. I loved her for that, for thinking I could be fixed. Took me 20 years to realize I didn't need fixing. I needed accepting. Your mother couldn't do that. Not her fault. I was asking the impossible. Did you ever regret marrying her? No, because she gave me you. He met Sarah's eyes. You're the only thing I got right, even when I was getting everything else wrong. The statement hung between them, weight and gift intertwined. Before Sarah could respond, Marcus appeared in the workshop entrance. We've got movement. 3 vehicles circling the property. Not trying to hide it. Frank stood, pain forgotten in the face of immediate threat. Viper? Can't confirm, but timing suspicious. Marcus moved to the window, assessed sightlines. We've got 12 riders positioned around the perimeter. But if this is what I think it is, It's a distraction. Frank finished the thought. Keep us focused outside while the real move happens somewhere else. Sarah's phone buzzed. Unknown number, she answered on speaker. Ms. Mitchell. Viper's voice smooth and confident. That was quite a performance the other night. Playing hero, taking bullets. Very impressive. What do you want? Same thing everyone wants. Respect, legacy, the knowledge that I matter. His tone shifted. Your father humiliated me in front of everyone, made me look weak. I can't allow that to stand. So you're calling to threaten me? Sarah kept her voice level. Seems inefficient, not threatening, informing. You and Frank Mitchell. Midnight. The old shipyard on the north waterfront. You come alone, we talk. You don't come, I burn the Steel Wolves clubhouse with everyone inside. The line went dead. Sarah looked at her father and Marcus. Both men wore expressions she recognized. Warriors calculating odds and preparing for violence that diplomacy couldn't prevent. It's a trap, Marcus stated the obvious. He wants you isolated, vulnerable. Frank moved to a cabinet, pulled out a map of Red Haven, spread it across his workbench beside the crib. The juxtaposition of past and future, violence and innocence, struck Sarah with almost physical force. Old shipyard's been abandoned since 2018. 8 buildings, 2 piers, maybe 20 good sniper positions. Frank marked locations with a grease pencil. We go in blind, we're dead in under a minute, so we don't go in blind. Marcus pulled out his phone. I've got guys who know that facility. Worked there before it closed. We can position before midnight. Create our own ambush. Sarah watched them plan, 2 generations of military experience coordinating tactics. Part of her wanted to argue, to suggest negotiation or police involvement. The rest of her understood that some threats required meeting force with force. Viper had made his choice. Now they had to make theirs. I'm going. Sarah's declaration stopped both men. He wants me and Dad. We give him what he wants, but on our terms. You're pregnant. Frank's objection carried paternal concern overriding tactical consideration. And I'm the only one who's seen him up close since his arrest. I can read him, see if he's bluffing about the clubhouse or if there's a real threat. Sarah touched her bandaged arm. Plus, I'm already shot. What's he going to do, wound me twice? The gallows humor fell flat. Marcus and Frank exchanged glances that communicated without words. Finally, Marcus nodded. We do it smart, you and Frank as bait. But steel wolves surrounding the facility. Sharpshooters, reaction teams, police on standby. He looked at Frank. Linda Hayes owes us. Time to call in that favor. Frank agreed. We go in knowing it's a trap. We spring it on our terms. And nobody dies if we can avoid it. Midnight approached with the weight of inevitability. Sarah rode on the back of her father's shovelhead, the first time she'd been on a motorcycle since childhood. The engine's rumble vibrated through her, familiar and comforting despite circumstances. Behind them, invisible in the darkness, 40 steel wolves spread across Red Haven like ghosts. Positioning themselves according to the plan Marcus had refined over 6 hours of preparation. This wasn't assault. This was chess played with lives and loyalty. The shipyard materialized from darkness. Rusted hulks of buildings silhouetted against sky, barely lighter than the ground. Frank killed the engine 2 blocks out. They walked the final distance, boots crunching on gravel that announced their presence. Sarah's hand rested on the pistol at her hip. She'd never wanted to shoot someone, had trained for years hoping she'd never need to use that training in anger. Tonight might force that choice. The thought sat heavy in her chest beside the life growing there. Frank moved beside her, his presence steady despite the danger ahead. Whatever happened in the next hour, they were facing it together. The reunion Sarah hadn't known she needed and certainly hadn't planned. Lights flared across the shipyard, spotlights mounted on vehicles creating a perimeter of illumination. At the center, Victor Castellano waited. Not alone, 6 men flanked him, armed but not aiming. Theater, Sarah's tactical mind assessed. Viper wanted to talk before violence started. They walked into the light. Sarah's eyes adjusted, cataloged threats and positions. Viper looked different than he had at the police station. Calmer, more controlled, dangerous in ways rage never achieved. The war hero and his daughter. Viper's voice carried across the space. Walking into a trap like lambs to slaughter, either very brave or very stupid. Frank stopped 20 feet away, Sarah slightly behind and to his left, covered but not hidden. Neither brave nor stupid. Tired. Tired of men like you hurting communities we're trying to protect. Communities you failed to protect. Viper gestured around. This shipyard employed 300 people before economic policies your generation championed shipped all the jobs overseas. You talk about protection. I see abandonment. The accusation held enough truth to sting. Frank's generation had inherited post-war prosperity and spent it without thought to sustainability. Sarah's generation inherited the consequences. Viper's generation got caught in the transition, neither winners nor beneficiaries. You're not wrong about the economy. Frank's admission surprised everyone, including Sarah. But you're wrong about the solution. Hurting people doesn't fix broken systems. It just adds more damage. You humiliated me. Viper's control cracked slightly, in front of everyone. Said I wasn't a real veteran because I didn't see combat. You have any idea what that's like? Serving your country and having people dismiss you because your service wasn't violent enough? Sarah stepped forward before Frank could respond. I know exactly what that's like. Coast Guard doesn't get the same respect as Navy SEALs. Search and rescue isn't as sexy as direct action. But I saved lives. That's service. Your supply work kept combat units functional. That's service too. The difference isn't what we did, it's whether we let insecurity about it define us. Viper's attention shifted to her. The woman who took a bullet. You're either the bravest person I've met or the most damaged. Both. Sarah held his gaze. And right now I'm a pregnant woman standing in a shipyard at midnight trying to convince you that revenge won't heal whatever's broken inside you. The revelation of her pregnancy rippled through the assembled men. Viper's expression flickered, something almost human beneath the calculated menace. Why are you here? Why risk your baby for this? Because violence begets violence until someone chooses different. My father walked away from the club to be a better man, came back to it to save innocent people. You spent 50 years trying to prove you're tough enough to matter. We're done proving things. Now we just act based on who we are. Viper raised his gun, aimed at Frank. You took everything from me. My organization, my reputation, my future. No. Frank's voice carried absolute certainty. You took all that from yourself, made choices based on ego instead of principle, hurt people to feel strong. That's not my failure, it's yours. Then I've got nothing left to lose. Viper's finger moved to the trigger. Sarah stepped between the gun and her father. Same position as 3 days ago. Same instinct. Different stakes. You shoot him, you have to shoot me first. Shoot a pregnant woman on purpose. That who you want to be? That the legacy you're building? The moment stretched. Gun aimed at Sarah. Father behind her. Assassins surrounding them. And somewhere in the darkness, steel wolves waiting for the signal to intervene. Lights erupted from all directions. Police vehicles, motorcycles, tactical units. Detective Linda Hayes' voice boomed through a megaphone. Victor Castellano, drop the weapon. You're surrounded. Viper's men dropped their guns immediately, professionals who knew when the game was over. But Viper kept his aim steady, on Sarah, on the barrier between him and Frank. Do it. Viper's voice broke. Prove I matter. Prove my death means something, even if my life didn't. The desperation in those words cut deeper than any threat. Sarah saw him clearly then. Not a criminal mastermind, a broken man who'd spent 50 years chasing validation that nothing could provide. Vietnam veteran who'd never proven himself in combat. Biker who'd never earned real respect. Criminal whose organization crumbled under scrutiny. Your death won't prove anything. Sarah kept her voice gentle. But your surrender might prove you're more than your worst choices, might give you time to become someone worth being. Behind her, Frank spoke. Tommy Cross didn't die so his grandson could watch more violence. Didn't sacrifice himself so decades later, old men could kill each other over pride. He died protecting brothers. That's the legacy worth honoring. Viper's gun wavered. Linda Hayes moved closer, officers flanking her. 20 weapons are aimed at one desperate man. It's not too late. Sarah extended her hand, even now, even after everything. You can choose different. The gun lowered. Viper's shoulders sagged as decades of rigid posturing collapsed. Officers moved in, cuffed him with professional efficiency, but Linda signaled them to maintain dignity. No excessive force, no unnecessary humiliation. As they led Viper past Sarah and Frank, he stopped. Met Frank's eyes, I'm sorry. For everything, for wasting my life being someone I hated. Frank nodded. So am I, for not recognizing sooner that we're all veterans of something. All carrying damage we didn't choose. Maybe prison gives you time to heal what war broke. Viper continued toward the patrol car. The shipyard emptied of threat, tension bleeding away into autumn night. Sarah turned to find her father looking at her with expression she'd seen only a handful of times. Pure, undiluted pride. You stood in front of another bullet. Frank's voice roughened. Need to stop making a habit of that. Need to stop putting myself in situations where bullets are involved. Sarah managed a smile. Think we can manage that? Probably not, but we can try. Marcus approached with Gunner and Rex. The operation had gone exactly as planned. No shots fired. No casualties. Justice served through overwhelming presence and calculated mercy. The opposite of what Viper had expected from motorcycle club politics. Your daughter's a natural tactician, Marcus addressed Frank. That move with the pregnancy reveal humanized the situation. Gave Viper an out that preserved some dignity. Wasn't tactical. Sarah leaned against her father's bike, exhaustion catching up to adrenaline's retreat. Was honest. I'm tired of dehumanizing people, even people who hurt me. Gunner studied her with assessment that transcended the immediate moment. You're Jack Brennan's goddaughter, whether you know it or not. Got his sense of when to fight and when to talk. The revelation struck Sarah cold. I'm what? Frank sighed. Your mother and I were going to tell you when you were older. Jack stood as your godfather at baptism. Before things got complicated, before I left the club, you're connected to Steel Wolves, whether you claim it or not. Sarah processed this information. 28 years of being Jack Brennan's goddaughter without knowing it. Connected to the brotherhood her father had built and abandoned. Legacy she'd inherited despite never being told. The ride back to Frank's workshop happened in silence. Sarah held tight to her father's waist, mind racing through revelations and consequences. Behind them, Steel Wolf's convoy rolled through Red Haven streets. Visible, powerful, protectors instead of predators. At the workshop, members gathered for debrief. Dylan Cross was there with Melissa. Both of them looked younger than their years, trauma still fresh, but healing visible in the way they held themselves. Dylan approached Sarah and Frank. Thank you. For everything, for not treating me like a criminal, for saving my sister, for showing me what real strength looks like. Frank pulled the young man into brief embrace. Your grandfather would be proud. You faced impossible choices and came out the other side willing to do better. That's all any of us can ask. Melissa hugged Sarah carefully, mindful of injuries. You saved my life. I don't know how to repay that. Pay it forward. Sarah smiled. Be someone worth saving. That's payment enough. The gathering transitioned from tactical debrief to celebration. Beer appeared, stories flowed. 3 generations of warriors sharing space and history. Sarah found herself in conversations with men who'd served in every American conflict since Vietnam. Each of them carrying damage. Each of them choosing daily to be more than their worst moments. Near midnight, Sarah and Frank stood outside the workshop. The crib was visible through the window, waiting for the grandchild who'd arrive in 6 months. Waiting for new life to balance all the death they'd witnessed. What are you going to name her? Frank asked. How do you know it's a girl? Don't know. Hope. Always wanted a granddaughter who'd grow up tough like her mother. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, comfortable silence stretching between them. Francis, after you. Frankie for short. Frank's breath caught. You don't have to. I want to. Want her to know where she comes from, the warrior who survived Vietnam and founded a brotherhood, who made mistakes but never stopped trying, who came back when it mattered most. The acceptance settled over Frank like absolution he'd never expected to receive. His daughter, naming her child after him, trusting him to be part of that child's life, despite everything. I'll try not to screw this up. Frank's voice carried vulnerability that age had earned. You'll screw it up sometimes. That's allowed. Just keep showing up. That's all Frankie will need. Sarah looked up at the stars barely visible through Red Haven's light pollution. That's all any of us need. 6 months later, spring replaced autumn and life continued its relentless march toward whatever came next. Sarah's belly had grown round with Frankie's presence. The baby kicked constantly, restless energy inherited from warrior ancestors. The Steel Wolves held their annual memorial ride on a Saturday in May. 200 bikes gathered to honor fallen members, including Jack Brennan, whose decade-old death still shaped the club's culture. Frank rode at the head of the old guard, Gunner beside him like they'd been 50 years earlier. Sarah rode in a sidecar attached to her father's shovelhead, custom-built and padded for pregnancy safety. Ridiculous and perfect simultaneously. Frank had argued she should skip the ride. Sarah had reminded him she'd taken bullets while pregnant. A motorcycle ride seemed tame by comparison. The convoy rolled through Red Haven with engines throttled low out of respect. Residents lined the streets, waving at riders who'd become part of the community's identity. Steel Wolves weren't feared here. They were family. At the cemetery, Frank stopped at Jack Brennan's grave. Marcus stood beside his father's headstone, weathered granite that bore simple inscription: Jack Ironside Brennan, founder, father, brother. Frank hadn't visited this grave in 10 years, hadn't felt welcome. Marcus's invitation had changed that, healed wounds that needed healing before they festered beyond repair. Hey, Jack, Frank's voice carried across memorial silence. Been a while. I know you died angry at me. Probably had the right. I left when you needed me. Chose my family over our brotherhood. He paused, gathering thoughts shaped by decades of regret. But I'm back now. Your boy's doing incredible work, leading with principle instead of pride. The club you built is stronger because of him. Marcus moved beside Frank. He's here because my father made Steel Wolves mean something beyond leather and chrome. Made it about protecting instead of praying. That legacy continues. Frank looked at his goddaughter's son, the young president carrying his father's name with honor. Jack would have appreciated. Your father and I survived Vietnam together, built this club together. Let pride separate us. He knelt beside the grave, knees protesting. I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. Sorry I let our friendship die before you did. Sarah approached, her pregnant belly announcing Frankie's imminent arrival. She stood beside her father, placed a hand on the headstone. Uncle Jack, I never got to know you, but I see your legacy in Marcus, in this club, in the way Dad talks about you with respect that transcends whatever arguments you had. The memorial service honored 12 fallen members. Stories shared, tears shed, brotherhood reaffirmed across generation gaps. When it ended, Dylan Cross approached the microphone. The young man had transformed in 6 months. Clean, employed at a Steel Wolves garage, working toward prospect status. Melissa stood nearby, back in college, healing from trauma through therapy and time. My grandfather died in Vietnam before I was born. Tommy Cross, Lance Corporal, Marine Corps. I never met him. But 6 months ago, I met Frank Mitchell. Gears, the man my grandfather saved, the man who saved me. Dylan's voice strengthened. I was given impossible choices by evil men. I made terrible decisions. But Frank and Marcus and this brotherhood, they showed me that mistakes don't define you. How you handle them does. Grandpa Tommy sacrificed himself protecting brothers. I'm trying to honor that by protecting this community, by being worth the second chance I was given. Applause rippled through the gathering. Frank felt pride swell in his chest. Tommy Cross's grandson, redeemed and purposeful. Another life saved, another promise partially kept. After the ceremony, Marcus pulled Frank aside. The club voted, we want to make you honorary president emeritus. Advisor role, no administrative duties, just wisdom when needed. Frank started to protest, but Marcus raised a hand. You earned it. 50 years ago when you founded this club. 20 years ago when you walked away to be a better father. 6 months ago when you came back to save Dylan and Melissa. You've always been Steel Wolves. Patch just makes it official. Sarah appeared beside them. Say yes, Dad. Frankie needs to see her grandfather wearing his colors, needs to know the warrior who survived everything they knew. The moment crystallized. Three people representing past, present, and future, offering Frank the identity he'd suppressed for 2 decades. Validation that maybe he'd done enough right to balance the wrong. Yes, Frank accepted the patch Marcus extended. Simple leather with embroidered text. Honorary President Emeritus. Above it, the wolf that had defined him at 23. Thank you for remembering who I used to be, for letting me become that person again. Francis Frankie Mitchell entered the world on June 15th, screaming with volume that suggested warrior bloodline. 8 pounds, healthy, perfect. Sarah held her daughter and wept with joy she hadn't known she could still access. Frank stood beside the hospital bed, looking at his granddaughter with expression that cycled through wonder and fear, and love too large for any single emotion. She's beautiful. Looks like you did at that age. She looks like a wrinkled potato. Sarah laughed through tears, but she's my potato. Frankie's tiny hand wrapped around Frank's finger. The grip was surprisingly strong. This baby would grow up knowing her grandfather, would hear stories about Vietnam and steel wolves and the complicated path that led to her existence, would understand that warriors protected people, that mistakes could be owned, that redemption was always possible if you kept showing up. Over the next months, Frank became constant presence, changed diapers with the same precision he'd once cleared tunnels in Vietnam, fed Frankie at 2 a.m. while Sarah recovered from delivery, built toys in his workshop with the same care he'd built the crib. Sarah documented everything, photos of grandfather and granddaughter, Frank teaching Frankie about tools while she was still too young to understand, reading to her from books about brave women and worthy men, taking her on short motorcycle rides in the custom sidecar, going nowhere except around the block, but making those trips adventures. The Steel Wolves embraced Frankie as their unofficial mascot. Marcus declared her honorary future member. Gunnar predicted she'd be chapter president before 30. Rex taught her at 6 months old the club handshake. The brotherhood extended to include one small girl who'd grow up surrounded by warriors who'd protect her with their lives. October arrived again, 1 year after the shot that had changed everything. Red Haven held memorial event on Pine Street. Plaque installed where Sarah had taken Viper's bullet, where courage lives. Sarah stood at the podium, Frankie in a carrier against her chest. The baby slept through her mother's speech, peaceful in the chaos. Year ago, I was broken. Hiding in this town, pretending I was fine while dying inside. Then I saw someone about to die, and my body moved before my mind could stop it. She paused, finding her father in the crowd. Frank stood with Marcus and the Steel Wolves, all of them in their colors. Her family, claimed and chosen. I thought I was saving Marcus Brennan's life. Really, I was saving my own. Because that moment connected me to my father, to a community, to purpose I'd lost after my Coast Guard team died. The crowd listened with attention that suggested her words resonated beyond their immediate context. Sarah continued, "We're not defined by our damage. We're defined by what we do with it. My father carried Vietnam for 50 years, carried the weight of leaving a brotherhood he loved, carried regret that shaped everything. But when it mattered most, he showed up. He acted. He chose right over easy." She looked down at sleeping Frankie. This baby will grow up knowing her grandfather is a warrior, knowing that warriors protect people, even when protection costs blood and pain, knowing it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Applause filled Pine Street. Sarah stepped down, handed Frankie to Frank while she accepted congratulations and thanks. The baby woke in her grandfather's arms, looked up at him with eyes that held infinite trust. Frank walked away from the crowd, needed air and space to process emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Found himself at the harbor, watching fishing boats return with the day's catch. Normal life continuing while warriors processed what they'd survived. His phone buzzed, unknown number. Frank almost ignored it. Curiosity made him answer. Frank Mitchell. Male voice, official but not threatening. "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Marine Corps. Retired. I served as intelligence liaison in Vietnam. Your name came across my desk in regards to classified operations around Quezon, November 1970. Frank's blood went cold. November 1970 was burned into his memory. The operation that had killed Tommy Cross. The mission that had haunted him for 53 years. What about it? Files were recently declassified. We need to talk about what really happened that day, about who gave the orders, about why Tommy Cross was sent into that ambush. The implications settled like stone in Frank's stomach. Ambush, not accident, not bad luck. Somebody had known. Somebody had sent Tommy and his team into kill zone deliberately. Why now? After all these years? Because someone wants you to know the truth. Or wants to see how you react to knowing it. Morrison's voice carried warning. This goes deep, involves people still alive, still powerful. You open this door, you can't close it again. Frank looked at Frankie, sleeping peacefully in his arms. His granddaughter, his future, the life he'd built from wreckage and regret. Opening old wounds could destroy the fragile peace he'd finally achieved. But Tommy Cross deserved truth, deserved his grandson knowing that his death hadn't been random, deserved justice that half a century had denied. When do we talk? Frank's decision made itself. I need to know what happened. I'll be in Red Haven next week. We'll meet somewhere private, come alone. And Frank? Morrison paused. Be prepared. What you learn might change how you see everything. The line went dead. Frank held Frankie close, breathed in baby powder and innocence. Whatever secrets November 1970 held, they'd waited 53 years. They could wait one more week. Sarah appeared beside him, took Frankie gently. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have. Frank kissed his granddaughter's forehead. But nothing changes. Not us, not this family. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Sarah nodded, understanding despite not knowing specifics. That's what warriors do, face what comes together. They walked back toward the memorial, toward the community that had embraced them both. The sun set over Red Haven, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and terrible, like everything worth remembering. Frank carried the weight of incoming revelation alongside the bow of present redemption. Both were true, both mattered. Life wasn't either or. It was an damage and healing, past and future, warrior and grandfather. He was all of it. Finally, completely honestly himself, and that would be enough for whatever came next.